When Emily's father passes away, she trusts her sister, Laura, to handle their inheritance fairly. But as months go by, Emily struggles to make ends meet while Laura flaunts a sudden lavish lifestyle. Suspicion turns to betrayal when Emily uncovers shocking evidence: Laura has stolen the majority of their father's legacy. Determined to expose her sister, Emily sets an elaborate plan into motion. However, what begins as a fight for justice spirals into a scandal that shakes the very foundation of their family. As Emily digs deeper, she uncovers a hidden offshore account tied to their father, along with secrets about his past that reveal he wasn't the man she thought he was. Torn between protecting his legacy and seeking the truth, Emily faces a devastating choice that will change her life forever. The day my father died felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. He was the rock of our family, the kind of man who held everything together. Losing him wasn't just heartbreaking, it was disorienting. It felt as though the foundation of my life had crumbled, leaving me standing on shaky ground, unsure of what to do next. Laura, my older sister, seemed to take charge almost immediately. While I was consumed by grief, she became the one to handle all the logistical details, the funeral arrangements, closing out his accounts, and working with his lawyer. "You don't need to worry about anything," she'd said, giving me a soft, almost condescending smile. "I'll take care of it all. You just focus on healing." At the time, I was grateful. Laura had always been the more assertive one, the one who seemed to know how to handle things. I was the quieter sister, the one who preferred to avoid conflict. So, I let her take the reins without a second thought. After all, she was family, my sister. If there was anyone I could trust in this world, it was her. Or so I thought. Dad's will was clear: everything was to be split evenly between us. His house, his savings, his investments, it was all supposed to be divided 50-50ths. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office and hearing those words, feeling a brief sense of relief amidst the sorrow. At least there would be no complications. At least Dad had made things simple for us. But over the next few months, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. It began with Laura's lifestyle. She had always been careful with money, living modestly even though she earned a decent salary as a marketing manager. But suddenly, she was driving a brand new luxury car. A shiny red convertible, the kind that turned heads wherever it went. Then came the vacations, week-long trips to tropical resorts, ski weekends in Aspen, and photos of her sipping champagne on yachts that she casually posted on social media. At first, I thought maybe she'd gotten a big raise at work. But then I remembered that Laura was notoriously tight-lipped about her job. She never talked about promotions or bonuses, and she never seemed like the type to splurge. Something wasn't adding up. Meanwhile, my own financial situation was bleak. Dad had always helped me out here and there when things got tight, but now that he was gone, I felt the weight of every bill and expense. I kept waiting for the money from the inheritance to kick in, but all I'd received so far was a modest check that barely covered 2 months of rent. When I asked Laura about it, she waved me off. "These things take time," she'd said, not even looking up from her phone. "The lawyer's still sorting everything out. Don't worry, I'll let you know as soon as it's ready." Her words didn't sit right with me. But I pushed the doubts away, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. Laura wouldn't lie to me. She wouldn't cheat me. She was my sister. We'd grown up together, shared secrets, supported each other through breakups and bad days. She wouldn't do something so cruel, would she? The turning point came one afternoon when I stopped by Laura's house unannounced. She lived in a sleek new townhouse in an upscale neighborhood, a far cry from the modest apartment she'd lived in before. I was surprised she hadn't mentioned moving. When I rang the doorbell, she answered wearing an expensive-looking silk robe, her hair perfectly styled even though it was the middle of the day. "Emily," she said, her tone a little too cheerful. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood," I lied. "I thought I'd stop by and say hi." Her eyes flickered with something, nervousness, annoyance, before she quickly stepped aside to let me in. As I walked into the living room, I couldn't help but notice the glossy new furniture, the massive flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, the designer throw pillows that probably cost more than my entire grocery budget for the month. Everything about her home screamed luxury. "Wow," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "This place is amazing. When did you move in?" "Just a few weeks ago," she said, waving a hand like it was no big deal. "It's nothing fancy. I just needed a change, you know." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. How could she afford this? Even with a good salary, this kind of lifestyle didn't make sense. And why hadn't she mentioned any of this to me? We were sisters, we were supposed to share these things with each other. As we sat down for coffee, I decided to bring up the inheritance. "So, have you heard anything from the lawyer recently? About Dad's estate?" Laura's smile faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered. "Oh, yeah. Everything's still in progress. You know how these things are, lots of paperwork, lots of delays. But don't worry, Em. You'll get your share soon." Her tone was breezy, casual. But something about the way she avoided eye contact set off alarm bells in my head. For the first time, I felt a cold, sinking suspicion that Laura wasn't being entirely honest with me. After that visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The doubts that I'd been trying to ignore came flooding back, louder and more insistent than ever. What if Laura wasn't just handling the inheritance? What if she was stealing from me? The thought made me feel sick. I wanted to believe it wasn't true, that my own sister wouldn't betray me like that. But the evidence was starting to pile up, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything. If Laura really was lying to me, what was I supposed to do? Confront her? Call her out? Part of me wanted to march over to her house and demand answers. But another part of me, an angrier, more calculating part, wanted to do something else. If Laura was lying to me, then I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to expose her. But first, I needed proof. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination I hadn't felt in months. If Laura was hiding something, I was going to find out exactly what it was. I didn't want to jump to conclusions without evidence. I couldn't just accuse her based on a hunch. So, I decided to approach this like my father would have, methodically, with a clear plan. Step 1 was reaching out to Dad's lawyer, Mr. Grayson. I hadn't spoken to him since the reading of the will, but he'd always struck me as a no-nonsense type of man. I figured he'd be able to clarify the situation, or at least confirm whether Laura was telling the truth about the delays. I scheduled an appointment to meet him at his office downtown. When I arrived, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and resolve. What if I was wrong? What if I was making a fool of myself by even entertaining these suspicions? But as soon as Mr. Grayson greeted me and led me into his office, those doubts began to fade. I could tell by his expression that something wasn't right. "Emily, it's good to see you," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. "What can I help you with?" I hesitated for a moment, then decided to be direct. "I just wanted to check on the status of my father's estate. Laura's been handling most of the communication, but it feels like things are taking longer than they should. Is there something I should know?" He frowned, shuffling through a few papers on his desk before looking up at me. "Emily, the estate was finalized months ago. Both you and your sister were sent your portions of the inheritance. Didn't you receive the funds?" The room seemed to tilt slightly. I only received one check. It wasn't much, just enough to cover a couple of months of expenses. Laura told me the rest was still being processed." Mr. Grayson's expression hardened. "That's not true. The funds were divided evenly and distributed to both of you shortly after the will was read. There were no delays." My stomach dropped. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. So it was true. Laura had lied to me. She'd taken the money that was rightfully mine and left me in the dark. I tried to keep my composure, but my hands were trembling. Is there any way to track where the money went? I asked, my voice shaking. I need to know what happened. Mr. Grayson nodded. I can provide you with a detailed breakdown of the transactions. If there's been any foul play, it'll be clear from the records. He handed me a stack of documents, and as I flipped through them, my suspicions were confirmed. The inheritance had been split into 2 accounts, as outlined in the will. But Laura's account showed multiple large transfers, amounts that far exceeded her share. She'd siphoned money from my portion into her own account, disguising it as joint expenses or legal fees. It was all there, black and white. She'd stolen nearly 75% of the inheritance. I left Mr. Grayson's office in a daze, clutching the documents like they were my lifeline. The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave. I couldn't believe it. My own sister, the person I'd trusted more than anyone, had been quietly robbing me this entire time. And for what? So she could live in a fancy townhouse and drive a shiny car. So she could take vacations while I struggled to make ends meet. But as the anger bubbled up inside me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Laura thought she'd fooled me, but she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The next step in my plan was to gather more evidence. The documents from Mr. Grayson were damning, but I wanted to make sure I had an airtight case before I confronted her. I started digging into Laura's finances, using everything I could find online. Social media was surprisingly helpful. Her Instagram and Facebook were filled with photos of her new car, her vacations, her lavish shopping sprees. Each post felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of how brazenly she'd been enjoying the money she'd stolen from me. I also reached out to a tech-savvy friend of mine, Mark, who worked in cybersecurity. I explained the situation to him, leaving out some of the more emotional details, and asked if there was any way to trace Laura's transactions. He agreed to help, and within a week, he'd uncovered even more evidence of her deception. She'd opened multiple accounts in her name and funneled the stolen money through them to make it harder to trace. But Mark was thorough, and he was able to piece it all together. When I saw the full extent of what she'd done, I felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, calculated theft. Laura had gone out of her way to hide the truth from me, knowing full well how much I was struggling. And yet, as furious as I was, I couldn't shake the sadness. This was my sister, the person I'd grown up with, the person I'd laughed and cried with. How could she do this to me? How could she betray me so completely? But I didn't let those feelings distract me from my goal. I wasn't just going to confront Laura. I was going to expose her. If she thought she could manipulate me and get away with it, she had another thing coming. For the next few weeks, I played the role of the naive, struggling sister. I sold my car and started taking the bus, claiming that I couldn't afford the payments anymore. I canceled plans with friends, telling them I was too broke to go out. I even borrowed money from Laura a couple of times, just to see how far she was willing to take her act. Each time I asked for help, she'd sigh dramatically and act like she was doing me some huge favor. "You really need to get your finances in order, Em," she said one day as she handed me a crisp $100 bill. "You can't keep relying on other people to bail you out." I wanted to scream at her, to throw the evidence in her face and demand answers. But I knew I had to be patient. The more I played into her narrative, the more confident she became. She thought she'd won. She thought I was clueless. But I was just getting started. The act was working. Laura believed she had me right where she wanted me, weak, desperate, and utterly dependent on her crumbs of kindness. But every time she handed me cash with that smug smile on her face, I felt the fire inside me burn hotter. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. The stage was being set, and soon, the curtain would rise on her downfall. With every interaction, I studied her closely. Laura was so confident, so sure of herself, that she never suspected I was digging deeper behind the scenes. But what she didn't know was that I'd been quietly gathering everything I needed to not only confront her but to completely dismantle the web of lies she'd spun. The real breakthrough came when I decided to test her one more time. I needed to see how far her greed would go. One afternoon, I called her, my voice shaky and pitiful, an Oscar-worthy performance. "Laura, I don't know what to do," I stammered. "I'm late on rent again. My landlord's threatening to evict me if I don't come up with the money by the end of the week. I hate to ask, but, could you lend me just $500? I promise I'll pay you back as soon as I can." On the other end of the line, there was a pause. For a brief moment, I thought she might actually say no, that she'd finally admit she didn't care enough to help me anymore. But then she sighed, as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. "Fine," she said, her tone dripping with exasperation. "I'll send you the money. But you really need to figure this out, Emily. I can't keep bailing you out." "Thank you," I whispered, doing my best to sound pathetic. "I promise I'll figure something out soon." The $500 arrived in my account later that day. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. She was sending me a fraction of the money she'd stolen from me, acting like she was some kind of saint for helping me. But it was exactly what I needed to confirm what I already knew. Laura didn't just steal from me, she thought I was stupid enough to let her keep getting away with it. Now that I had every piece of the puzzle, it was time to put my plan into motion. I started by calling a family meeting. This wasn't something we did often, but I framed it as a way to honor Dad's memory and discuss some family matters. Laura didn't even hesitate when I brought it up. If anything, she seemed pleased that I was too busy looking backward to suspect her schemes. On the day of the meeting, I cleaned my apartment until it was spotless. Then, I set the stage. Copies of the documents from Mr. Grayson, screenshots of Laura's social media posts, and Mark's breakdown of her financial transactions, all of it was carefully laid out on my dining table, ready to be unveiled. Laura was the first to arrive, dressed to impress in a tailored blazer and designer heels. She looked around the apartment with barely concealed disdain, her nose wrinkling slightly as she took in the modest furniture and lack of decor. "Emily, this place could really use an upgrade," she said, brushing a piece of invisible lint off her sleeve. "Maybe if you stopped wasting money on, whatever it is you waste it on, you could actually afford something decent." I bit my tongue, forcing a smile. "Thanks for the advice, Laura. I'll keep that in mind." Soon, the rest of the family arrived, our aunt and uncle, a couple of cousins, and even Mr. Grayson, who'd agreed to come at my request. Everyone was in good spirits, chatting and reminiscing about Dad. Laura played the part of the perfect sister, laughing and joking as if she hadn't done anything wrong. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted to the table every so often. She was nervous, even if she didn't want to show it. Finally, it was time. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and cleared my throat to get everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming today," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about something important, something that's been weighing on me for a while." Laura's smile faltered, just for a second. I turned to her, locking eyes with her as I continued. "It's about Dad's inheritance." The room went quiet. Laura's face froze, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "I trusted Laura to handle everything after Dad passed away," I said, my tone calm but firm. "I believed her when she told me the process was taking longer than expected. But recently, I discovered that wasn't true. The estate was finalized months ago, and the funds were distributed. What I didn't know was that Laura had funneled the majority of my share into her own accounts." Gasps filled the room. Laura shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger. What the hell are you talking about? She demanded. That's ridiculous. You're just upset because you're broke and can't manage your own money. I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached for the stack of documents on the table and began handing them out to everyone in the room. These are the bank statements showing the transfers Laura made from my account to hers, I said. Here's a breakdown from Dad's lawyer, confirming that the inheritance was split evenly on paper but stolen in practice. And here are screenshots of Laura's extravagant spending, vacations, luxury goods, a new house, all funded by the money she stole from me. Everyone stared at the evidence in silence, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. Laura looked like a deer caught in headlights, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to come up with an excuse. This is insane, she finally blurted out. You're trying to make me look bad because you're jealous of my success. You've always been jealous, Emily. Jealous of what? I shot back, my voice rising. Jealous of how you lied to me. Cheated me. Betrayed Dad's trust. I trusted you, Laura. I believed you when you said you'd take care of everything. And this is how you repay me. She started to say something else, but our aunt cut her off. Laura, this is unbelievable. How could you do this to your own sister? To your family? The room erupted into chaos. Everyone was talking at once, grilling Laura, demanding answers. Mr. Grayson stepped in to confirm the validity of the documents, leaving no room for doubt. Laura tried to defend herself, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every lie she tried to tell was met with cold, hard proof. By the time the meeting ended, Laura's carefully constructed facade had crumbled. She looked small, defeated, and utterly humiliated. She tried to leave without saying a word, but I stopped her at the door. You have two choices, I said quietly, so only she could hear. You can pay me back every cent you stole, or I can take this to court and let a judge decide your fate. Either way, you're not walking away from this. Her eyes filled with tears, not of remorse, but of pure, unfiltered rage. You're going to regret this, she hissed. No, I said, meeting her gaze with unwavering resolve. The only thing I regret is trusting you. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was also liberating. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But for now, I'd won the first battle. And I wasn't going to stop until I got the justice I deserved. In the weeks following the family meeting, Laura went radio silent. I didn't hear a single word from her, no calls, no texts, no attempts to make amends. Part of me was relieved. After everything she'd done, I didn't want to see her smug face or hear her fake apologies. But another part of me couldn't help but wonder what she was up to. Laura wasn't the type to just roll over and accept defeat. I assumed she'd take the logical route, repay what she owed to avoid a legal battle. With the evidence stacked against her, a court case would be a losing game for her. But Laura had always been unpredictable, and I should have known better than to underestimate her desperation. One evening, as I was sifting through paperwork with Mr. Grayson to finalize the process of recovering the stolen funds, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then picked up, expecting it to be a scam call or some routine inquiry. Instead, a nervous voice crackled through the line. Emily, it's Mark. I think you should sit down. Mark, my tech-savvy friend who had helped trace Laura's financial movements, sounded panicked. My stomach tightened. What is it? Did something happen? I was looking into those accounts again, just to tie up any loose ends, he said. And I found something. Something big. What are you talking about? I asked, my heart racing. There's a hidden account. One we didn't catch before. It's offshore, in the Cayman Islands. And it's not just Laura's name on it. I froze. What? Who else is involved? Mark hesitated, then said the last name I ever expected to hear, your dad. At first, I thought he was joking. That's impossible, I said, shaking my head. Dad would never hide money. He was the most honest man I knew. I thought so too, Mark said. But the account dates back at least 10 years, and the transactions, Emily, it's shady. There's evidence of some serious financial fraud tied to your father's business dealings. The room spun. My father? The man who taught me the importance of integrity and hard work. The man I'd idolized my entire life. I couldn't believe it. Are you sure? I whispered. Positive, Mark replied grimly. And there's more. It looks like Laura found out about the account after he died. That's how she got access to so much money so quickly. She didn't just steal from you, Emily, she tapped into his secret fortune. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. This wasn't just about Laura anymore. It wasn't even about the inheritance. It was about uncovering the truth, about my father, about his legacy, about everything I thought I knew. The next day, I confronted Laura. I didn't bother calling ahead. I drove straight to her townhouse and banged on the door until she answered. She looked disheveled, her hair unbrushed, her face pale. It was clear she'd been unraveling ever since the family meeting. What do you want? She snapped, crossing her arms. I know about the Cayman account, I said, cutting straight to the point. I know everything. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she quickly masked her shock with a sneer. So what? Are you here to play detective again? You've already ruined my life. What more do you want? I want the truth, I said. Dad's name is on that account, Laura. Did you know about it before he died? She hesitated, and in that moment, I knew I'd hit a nerve. Fine, she said, her voice bitter. You want the truth? Here it is, Dad wasn't the saint you thought he was. That account? It was a slush fund. He used it to hide money from the IRS, to bribe clients, to cover up all the shady deals he made over the years. And you know what? I found out about it before he died. I confronted him, and he promised me he'd make it right. But then he went and died, leaving me to clean up his mess. I stared at her, stunned. So you decided to steal from me instead? You don't get it, Emily, she snapped. That account wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. Dad owed people money. Bad people. After he died, they came knocking. I used some of the money to pay them off so they wouldn't come after us. Us? I repeated, incredulous. You mean you? You didn't do this to protect me, you did it to save your own skin. Laura didn't deny it. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe and gave me a hollow laugh. You're so naive, Emily. You've always been the good little girl, blind to the truth. Dad wasn't who you thought he was. And now, neither am I. I left her house in a daze, my mind racing. Everything I thought I knew about my father, about my family, was crumbling around me. But I wasn't about to let Laura off the hook. If anything, her confession gave me even more leverage. I went straight to Mr. Grayson and laid everything out for him. Together, we filed a formal legal claim against Laura, demanding the return of the inheritance funds she'd stolen. But I also did something else, something that felt like both justice and betrayal at the same time. I reported the offshore account to the authorities. It wasn't an easy decision. Exposing the account meant tarnishing my father's legacy, the very thing I'd been trying to protect. But I couldn't let his sins, and Laura's, go unchecked. I didn't want to live under the shadow of their lies anymore. The fallout was swift and brutal. The IRS launched an investigation into my father's business dealings, uncovering years of tax evasion and financial misconduct. Laura was implicated as well, thanks to her unauthorized access to the offshore account. She was hit with hefty fines and narrowly avoided jail time through a plea deal. But her reputation, and her cushy lifestyle, were completely destroyed. As for me, I walked away with my portion of the inheritance restored, but the cost was steep. My relationship with Laura was beyond repair, and my image of my father would never be the same. I'd uncovered the truth, but it came with a heavy price. Months later, as I stood in front of my father's grave, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a faint sense of closure. I placed a single flower on the headstone and whispered, "I wish you trusted me enough to tell me the truth." Walking away, I realized something important. Justice isn't always clean or satisfying. Sometimes, it's messy and painful. But in the end, it's the only way to move forward. And I was ready to leave the past behind.